White teens beat up a black skater thinking no one would stand for him, until the ground shook and Big Shaq arrived. What started as cruelty became a storm, because when legends rise for blood, no lie survives. And justice doesn't ask, it demands. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late afternoon sun spilled across Oak Ridge like warm honey, wrapping the quiet suburban streets in gold. On the far end of Marlowe Park, the skate park buzzed with a kind of low-grade electricity. Teenagers laughing, wheels grinding, music spilling from someone's portable speaker. Among them, Jalen O'Neal stood out, not just for his height or the smoothness of his moves, but for the way he skated like he had something to prove. He moved with intensity, each flip of the board crisp, every landing controlled, like he was dancing and daring the world to look away. But not everyone watching admired him. Chase, Trent, and Brody lounged by the halfpipe, their shadows stretched long by the sun. Their bikes leaned lazily beside them, as they threw out low-toned jokes between gulps of energy drinks. Chase's eyes locked onto Jalen, with the kind of smirk that never meant anything good. Brody whispered something, and all three laughed, but their laughter didn't carry the warmth of kids having fun. It was sharp, cold, dismissive.
Jalen felt it.
He always did. He'd lived in Oak Ridge long enough to read the room, to catch the coded words in the halls at school, and the side glances at gas stations. Being the only black skater in a mostly white crowd made him visible in all the wrong ways. He told himself to ignore it just like every other time. Just skate, Jay. That's all you came for. He pumped up the ramp, let the board catch air beneath him, and twisted into a clean heel flip. Applause rang from the far end, where a few middle schoolers watched with awe. But he clapped slow, mocking, rising from the bench with that same smirk as if Jalen's trick had confirmed something about him. Trent followed, casually tossing his drink into a trash can but missing entirely. Brody rolled his neck and stood last. And just like that, the three of them were moving. Not fast, not obviously, but with a rhythm that only Jalen could hear. He dropped back onto the concrete and headed toward the rail, mind focused, stomach turning. He didn't trust them. He'd seen this kind of build-up before, never full-on violence, but moments where things just happened to go wrong when they were near. Boards gone missing, bags mistakenly picked up, comments tossed too low for teachers to catch, but just loud enough to burn. He lined up for a grind, locked in, and slid clean. But mid-slide, a shout rang out.
Hey, show off!
Jalen flinched, board clattering out from under him, as he stumbled, hitting the ground hard on his elbow. Pain flared. He blinked against the sun, trying to catch his breath, when a sneaker kicked his board away, sending it clattering across the park. His eyes darted upward. Chase towered above him now, arms crossed, his face frozen in that performative innocence some folks wear like armor. "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there," he said, feigning surprise. "Didn't mean to ruin your little runway show," Trent added, lips curled in mock sympathy. Brody said nothing. He didn't have to. He was the one who'd taken Jalen's board just last week and left it dangling from the chain-link fence with "Know Your Place" scratched into the underside. Jalen hadn't told anyone. Who would believe it wasn't just teenage crap? Jalen sat up slowly, brushing grit from his palms. His heart pounded. He felt every eye on him, and worse, he felt the lack of action. Kids kept skating. A few looked over, and then looked away. A couple of girls on scooters exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing. He reached for his board, only for Chase to place a foot on it. "What's your rush?" Chase asked, smile thin. "We were just admiring your confidence." "Don't touch my board," Jalen said, quieter than he meant to. That was all it took. Chase leaned in, not with fists but with words like daggers wrapped in silk. "Thing is, you act like this park belongs to everyone. But we all know whose names are on the donor wall." He gestured toward the bronze plaque near the restrooms, where the names of the town's most generous contributors were etched. Every one of them was white. "Skate somewhere else," Trent added. "Like, I dunno, wherever you came from." Jalen didn't reply. Couldn't. His throat tightened as he stood up slowly, refusing to let them see him shaken. But inside, he was collapsing. Rage pressed against his ribs. He told himself he could handle Oak Ridge, that he could be the one who didn't lose his cool. That skating was his escape, but standing there, surrounded, his escape had turned into a cage. He walked toward the edge of the park without another word. Fists clenched, pride shattered, The pain in his elbow nothing compared to the one inside his chest. Someone called out, "You okay, man?" But it was too late to matter. The moment had already sunk into his skin like ink. By the time he reached the corner of the park, he could feel his board under his arm, scraped and dusty. His legs felt heavier with each step. The laughter behind him followed like smoke, and even though no bones were broken, something inside had cracked. At the far end of the block, a familiar black SUV slowed to a stop. "Jay." The voice was deep, warm, unmistakable. Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq to the world, rolled down the window, sunglasses catching the light. Jalen tried to put on a smile, tried to bury the shame. But Shaq's eyes were sharp. He'd seen too many locker rooms, too many bruised egos, too many fake grins, not to recognize the real thing. "You good?" he asked, his tone easy, but his gaze scanning his son's face, taking in the scrapes, the trembling hand that tried to tuck the board out of sight. Jalen hesitated. Just long enough. Shaq stepped out of the SUV. The skate park fell silent. Eyes turned, phones lifted. And for the first time since the fall, Jalen didn't feel small. He felt seen. And somewhere deep inside, the air shifted. Something had been set in motion. Something no one at that park, especially Chase and his crew, was ready for. Because Big Shaq wasn't just a father. He was a storm waiting to rise. The heat clung to Jalen's skin like a punishment as he left the skate park behind. His scraped palms burned. His knee throbbed from the fall, but none of it compared to the ache curling deep in his chest. His board was tucked under his arm, the edge of the deck digging into his ribs with each step. He could hear their laughter still even though he was blocks away. Chase's smirk, Trent's fake sympathy voice, Brody's smug silence. The humiliation echoed louder than the clatter of his wheels, louder than the chirping birds overhead, louder even than his own heavy breathing, as he made his way through the neat, winding streets of Oak Ridge. He wanted to run, but his legs were stiff. He wanted to cry, but his throat was dry. And above all, he wanted to disappear, just long enough to scrape this moment off his skin. Ahead, the O'Neal mansion waited like a fortress, perched at the edge of town where the lawns stretched wide and the trees arched high. But as Jalen trudged toward the wide iron gate, he realized he wasn't alone. Big Shaq stood at the entrance, arms crossed, sunglasses shading his eyes, his massive frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the setting sun. To the world, Shaquille O'Neal was a business titan, a former NBA superstar, a millionaire with endorsement deals, media appearances, and a brand larger than life. But to Jalen, at this moment, he was just Dad, and Dad was watching. Jalen stiffened, forcing his shoulders back, willing his scraped palms not to shake, willing his breath to stay even. But Shaq saw. He always saw. Without a word, he stepped forward, opening the gate with one slow push, the iron creaking faintly. Jalen walked through, eyes fixed on the ground, the board still clutched tightly to his side. Shaq walked alongside him, silent for a moment, matching his pace, his long shadow stretching across the driveway. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Lucille, Shaq's mother, sat by the window, knitting needles paused midair, her sharp eyes tracking Jalen's every movement. Shawnee, Shaq's ex-wife, appeared at the edge of the hallway, arms folded, lips pressed tight, worry etched into every line of her face. The family had been watching, not just today, but for weeks. They knew Jalen's spark had been dimming, his once carefree skate sessions clouded by a weight he couldn't name. But today, it was no longer hidden. Shaq gently took the board from Jalen's arms, setting it against the wall with careful precision. His voice, when it came, was soft but firm. "You okay, son?" The words weren't casual. They carried weight. They waited. Jalen hesitated, feeling the room press in. He wanted to say yes, to wave it off, to shrug like nothing mattered. But under his father's steady gaze, the facade cracked. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. They pushed me off my board." Shaq's eyes narrowed, not in rage, but in a quiet, coiled tension. "Who?" Jalen's shoulders sagged. "Chase. Trent. Brody." Lucille made a soft, disapproving sound, her needles clicking as she set them aside. Shawnee stepped closer, laying a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "Did they hurt you?" Jalen shook his head, but the wordless motion said more than his mouth could. The sting wasn't on the skin. It was deeper. It was the sting of standing alone while the world pretended not to see. Shaq let out a long breath, running a hand over his bald head. He wasn't a man easily rattled. He'd faced roaring crowds, championship pressure, ruthless media, but this was different. This was his son, and the ache in Jalen's eyes twisted something inside him he hadn't felt in years. A memory stirred, uninvited, the sound of jeers in his own youth, the coaches who saw only his size but not his heart, the subtle exclusions at parties, the endorsements that almost slipped away because someone decided he was too intimidating. He had learned to power through, to let success speak for itself, but watching his son shrink under the same weight cracked open old scars. That night after dinner, Shaq sat alone in his home office, staring at the glow of his phone. Tyrell, his old friend turned civil rights lawyer, was just a call away. But Shaq hesitated. This wasn't about filing lawsuits or making headlines. Not yet. This was about Jalen, about dignity, about teaching his son to navigate a world that would always look at him with loaded eyes, no matter how fast he skated or how clean his tricks were. Meanwhile, upstairs, Jalen lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the afternoon like a broken reel. The shame burned hot, but underneath it, something colder crept in, resentment. Why did they hate him for simply being there? Why was his presence an offense? Why did no one step in? His fingers clenched unconsciously, nails biting into his palms. He had no answers, only questions that weighed more heavily with each passing hour. Downstairs, Shaq finally picked up his phone, dialing Tyrell. The two men spoke in low tones, discussing not just legal options, but strategy, the kind that didn't involve fists or shouting matches. You have power, Shaq, Tyrell reminded him. But this isn't about crushing them. It's about exposing them, making the truth undeniable. The next morning, Jalen found himself in the kitchen, where Lucille handed him a plate of pancakes with a quiet smile. "Eat, baby," she said softly. "You need your strength." Her eyes met his, filled with a kind of fierce, unshakable love that made his throat tighten. Shawnee, standing at the sink, gave him a nod. "Your dad's working on something," she murmured, voice low. "Don't give up." Jalen didn't know what they meant. But when Shaq walked in, dressed not in sweats but a tailored blazer, his face set with determination, something in the room shifted. "Son," Shaq said, laying a massive hand on Jalen's shoulder, "we're not letting this slide." The next few days blurred into a whirlwind. Shaq reached out to the local skate community, gathering allies, parents, organizers. Quietly, he assembled a media team, people who knew how to control a narrative before others could twist it. Meanwhile, Tyrell worked behind the scenes, pulling public records, gathering evidence, setting the legal groundwork. There were no threats, no loud confrontations, just preparation, precision. Back at school, Jalen walked the halls with his head high, feeling the whispers but no longer crumbling under them. He knew his dad was working something behind the scenes, and more importantly, he knew he wasn't alone. One afternoon, as Shaq and Jalen stood side by side at the skate park, not to intimidate, not to confront, but simply to be there, the atmosphere shifted. Kids who once avoided Jalen now nodded in quiet respect. Some even joined him on the ramps, tentative but willing. Chase, Trent, and Brody lingered at the edges, eyes darting, unsure whether to mock or retreat. The ground had tilted beneath them, and they could feel it. Shaq watched all this with a careful eye, not intervening, not posturing, just present. And sometimes, presence was the most powerful statement of all. At home that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed purple, Jalen sat on the back porch, board resting at his feet. Shaq joined him, sinking into the chair beside him, the silence between them easy, companionable. "You know, son," Shaq said after a while, "I've won a lot of battles in my life. On the court, in business. But the biggest wins, they're the ones where you stand your ground without throwing a punch." Jalen looked at him, eyes wide, absorbing every word. "We're gonna handle this smart," Shaq continued, his voice gentle but steely, "because you're worth it, and because they need to learn. You don't get to break people, just because you think you can." Jalen nodded slowly, a flicker of strength returning to his gaze. For the first time in days, he smiled. And beneath the bruises, visible and invisible, something unshakable began to take root. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the edge of the kitchen island, his massive hands pressed flat against the marble, his broad shoulders hunched, his head lowered just slightly. It was a posture unfamiliar to those who only knew Big Shaq as the indomitable giant. The man who had faced championship games, ruthless media spotlights, and an empire of business negotiations without flinching. But tonight, Under the quiet glow of the kitchen lights, Shaq wasn't the towering figure of legend. He was a father carrying the unbearable weight of his son's unspoken pain. Jalen had gone to bed early, his dinner half-touched, his skateboard propped silently against the wall like a soldier resting after a battle. Lucille O'Neal watched her son from across the room, her knitting needles momentarily still in her lap, her sharp eyes softening with a mother's knowing sadness. "You want to fix it, Shaquille," she said quietly, "but you can't throw money at this. You know that, right?" Shaq let out a long, slow breath, dragging a hand across his face. "I know, Ma." His voice was low, strained, a deep rumble barely above a whisper. He trailed off, his jaw tightening. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't know how. He had built his life on the foundation of strength, physical, financial, emotional. But this was different. This was watching his son shrink inside his own skin, watching the light dim behind Jalen's bright eyes, and realizing that his own power couldn't shield his boy from the world's cruelty. Shoni appeared in the doorway, her arms folded loosely, her gaze soft but steady. She had been Shaq's wife once, and though their marriage hadn't lasted, the bond of family remained unbroken. "Shaq," she murmured, stepping into the room, "he needs more than a shield right now. He needs to know how to stand on his own." Shaq looked up sharply, his brows drawing together. "You think I don't know that?" His voice carried an edge, but it wasn't anger. It was the rawness of a man, grappling with helplessness. Shani didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice calm. "I think you've always been the protector, Shaquille. But this is about teaching him how to rise, not just how to fight." Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe. The room hung heavy with the words unspoken, that no matter how famous he was, no matter how wealthy, his son would still face a world eager to put him in a box, to clip his wings, to remind him, in countless subtle ways, of where they thought he belonged. He opened his eyes and looked at Lucille, who gave him a small, firm nod. "Dignity," she said quietly. "Not revenge." That word echoed in Shaq's mind long after the house had gone quiet for the night. Dignity. Not revenge. It was so tempting to storm down to the skate park, to confront those boys, to let his presence alone shake them into apology. He had done it before, not with fists but with towering authority, with the weight of his name. But as he sat alone in his study, staring at the framed photos of his championship days, the magazine covers, the business awards, he realized that if he wanted to teach Jalen the lesson that mattered, he couldn't fight this fight for him. He had to fight it with him, and he had to be smart about it. The next morning, Shaq sat with Jalen at the breakfast table, the clink of spoons and forks filling the space between them. Jalen picked at his cereal, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched. Shaq reached out, his giant hand resting gently over his son's much smaller one. "Look at me, Jay," he said softly. Jalen looked up, his eyes wary, the flicker of hurt still lurking in their depths. "We're not letting this go," Shaq said, his voice steady, warm, "but we're not going to handle it the way they expect. No yelling, no threats. We handle this with strategy." Jalen swallowed hard. "But they'll just keep lying. They'll twist it." Shaq gave a slow, knowing smile. "That's why we stay ahead. We don't play their game, son. We make them play ours." By mid-morning, Shaq was on the phone with Tyrell, his longtime friend and a sharp civil rights lawyer with a reputation for getting results without theatrics. Tyrell's voice crackled through the line, measured and calm. "We build a case, Shaq, not a courtroom case. Not yet, but a public one. You have the platform. Use it." Shaq paced the length of his office, his brow furrowed. "I want to do this right, T. No showboating. No headlines unless we need them." Tyrell's chuckle was low. "You forget, my friend. You are the headline. But we'll do this smart. We start gathering evidence. Witnesses. Community voices. We let the truth speak. And we make sure it's loud enough that no one can ignore it." Meanwhile, Shawnee reached out to parents in the neighborhood, carefully, discreetly, threading conversations that didn't come across as accusations, but as invitations. "We need to talk about what's happening at the park," she'd say, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to make sure all the kids feel safe." Some parents listened, some bristled, but the point wasn't to convince everyone. It was to stir the air, to start shifting the narrative before the other side could lock it down. Jalen, meanwhile, went back to school with his head high, even though his stomach twisted with nerves. The stares, the whispers, the pointed snickers from Chase and his crew all scraped at his nerves, but something was different now. He wasn't walking through it alone. He could feel the current of something larger at his back. His family, his father. A slow but steady swell of support rising where before there had only been isolation. One afternoon, Shaq picked Jalen up from school himself. The SUV pulling up to the curb with its polished black frame, gleaming in the sun. Jalen slid into the passenger seat, glancing sideways at his father. "You didn't have to come," he mumbled. Shaq grinned. "Nah, son. I wanted to." They drove in silence for a while, the streets of Oak Ridge slipping past in a blur of neatly trimmed hedges and clean sidewalks. Finally Shaq spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You know, when I was your age, I faced my share of this too. People thinking they could define me before I even opened my mouth. But you know what kept me going?" Jalen turned, curious despite himself. "What?" Shaq smiled softly. "Knowing that the best revenge isn't anger, it's success. It's knowing who you are, and never letting them shrink that." Jalen leaned back in his seat, feeling the words settle into his chest like an anchor. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the town glowed in the soft hues of dusk, Shaq gathered the family in the living room. Lucille sat with her knitting, Shawnee perched on the armrest, Jalen cross-legged on the floor. Shaq stood before them, his presence filling the space effortlessly. "We're not just responding to this moment," he said quietly. "We're setting the tone for how we handle all moments like this. We show them we won't be pushed down, and we do it with grace, with dignity, and with purpose." Jalen felt his chest swell, his heart thudding louder. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something stronger than anger, resolve. That night, as he lay in bed, Jalen stared at the ceiling, the darkness no longer feeling so heavy. He thought about the skate park, about Chase and the others, about the jeers and the silence of the crowd, and then he thought about his father, about the quiet power in Shaq's voice, about the calm fire behind his eyes. He realized that the weight his father carried wasn't just the weight of fame or fortune. It was the weight of knowing how to stand tall in a world that wanted to see you small. And maybe, just maybe, Jalen was ready to carry some of that weight himself. Shaq sat alone in his study, the walls lined with framed jerseys, championship rings displayed in glass, photos of his younger self grinning wide alongside teammates, coaches, celebrities. To the outside world, this room was a shrine to success, to glory, to the proof that Shaquille O'Neal had conquered every obstacle in his path. But tonight, the trophies felt hollow, the photos like old shadows. Tonight, they weren't reminders of victory. They were reminders of everything it had cost him to stand tall. His fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, his broad chest rising and falling as he let his memories pull him under. He was 17 again, walking onto the court in rural Louisiana, hearing the muttered slurs from the stands, feeling the referee's eyes linger on him longer, calling fouls on moves his white teammates pulled off without question. He was 19, rising as a college star, his face splashed across national headlines, but whispered about in corporate meetings. Too much attitude, too flashy, too urban. He was 25, signing endorsements with a smile stretched across his face, knowing full well that behind closed doors, executives debated whether he could fit the right image, whether he could sell to suburban families without scaring them. The words had followed him his entire life. Too big, too loud, too black. Now here he was, decades later, watching his son carry the same weight. Shaq leaned forward, pressing his elbows to his knees, his massive hands covering his face. It wasn't just about Jalen falling at the skate park. It was about a system that trained some boys to believe they belonged, and others to believe they didn't. No matter how skilled, how polite, how brilliant they were, he felt his heart pound not with rage, but with sharp cutting recognition. This wasn't just Jalen's fight. It was their fight. It was the fight of every black father who had ever looked his child in the eye and known that love alone couldn't shield them. The sharp ring of his cell phone snapped him out of the spiral. He glanced at the screen and saw a name that made him sit up straighter. Tyrell Harper. Tyrell had been one of Shaq's oldest friends, a man who had traded a college basketball scholarship for a law degree and a career fighting civil rights battles in courtrooms across the country. Shaq swiped the call open, his voice steady but tight. "Tyrell." "Shaq?" Tyrell greeted, his voice warm but laced with urgency. "I heard what happened. You okay?" Shaq exhaled slowly.
Yeah.
"I mean, no, not really." Tyrell let the silence settle before speaking again. "Listen to me, man. You don't just fight this at the skate park. You fight it where it really hurts, the reputation." Shaq's brow furrowed. Their reputation? Yes, Tyrell said firmly. Look, these kinds of boys, Chase, Trent, Brody, they're protected by more than their fists. They're protected by the stories people tell about them. The golden boys, the good families, the future leaders. You break that story, you make people see what's underneath. That's where change starts. Shaq rubbed his jaw, thinking hard. You're saying we go public? Not just public. Tyrell corrected. Strategic. You gather your witnesses. You document everything. You build a case, not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. You make sure the truth comes out in a way they can't control or spin. Shaq felt the stirrings of determination ignite in his chest. All right, he murmured. All right. After they hung up, Shaq sat for a long moment, staring out the window into the night. The moon hung low over Oak Ridge, casting long silver shadows across the lawn. Somewhere upstairs, Jalen was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with his own storm of shame, anger, and confusion. Shaq rose slowly, feeling the weight of his decision settle across his shoulders like armor. This wasn't about crushing some teenager. This was about confronting a system, and doing it in a way that taught his son dignity, not just defiance. The next morning, Shaq gathered the family at the kitchen table. Lucille sat tall, her sharp eyes fixed on her son, while Shawnee poured coffee and listened intently. Jalen, still groggy from sleep, rubbed his eyes as he slid into a chair. Listen up, Shaq began, his voice low but firm. We're going to handle this carefully. Not with anger, not with noise, with strategy. Jalen looked wary. What do you mean? Shaq leaned forward, his massive hands clasped on the table. We're going to gather evidence. We're going to talk to the kids who were there, the parents who saw what happened. We're going to make sure the truth is bigger than their lies. Jalen frowned, but they'll just keep twisting it. Chase's dad is on the city council. They control everything. Shaq gave a small, knowing smile. Not everything, son. Not the truth. For the next few days, the O'Neal household became a hive of quiet activity. Tyrell worked behind the scenes, coaching Shaq on how to approach witnesses, how to frame the conversations, how to avoid legal pitfalls. Shawnee reached out to local moms. She knew, the ones who cared about fairness, the ones who would listen. Lucille, fierce as ever, called community leaders and local pastors, stirring the beginnings of a quiet grassroots movement. Meanwhile, Shaq began showing up at the skate park, not as a looming celebrity, but as a father. He watched Jalen skate, cheered him on, chatted with other kids, made his presence a calm, unshakable force. His quiet support sent ripples through the community. Parents started asking questions. Kids who had stayed silent before began murmuring stories about what they'd seen. The shoves, the insults, the smirks. Word began to spread. Big Shaq wasn't just standing by. He was moving. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Shaq and Jalen watched the sky darken, the last streaks of pink fading into indigo. Jalen shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on his skateboard. Dad, he said quietly, what if it doesn't work? Shaq turned, his face gentle but serious. Then we keep standing. Jalen's brows furrowed. But what if they never stop? What if they just keep? Shaq cut him off softly. Son, they've been doing this a long time. To me, to my father, to his father. But every time we stand up, every time we refuse to let them tell the only story, we make it harder for them to keep doing it. That's the fight. Jalen stared at him, the words sinking deep. Shaq reached out, pulling his son into a one-armed hug, his massive frame sheltering the boy who had once fit in the crook of his elbow. You don't have to carry this alone, he murmured. You've got me. You've got all of us. As the night deepened, Shaq felt a strange calm settle over him. This wasn't a fight he had chosen, but it was a fight he was ready for. Not as a celebrity, not as a millionaire, but as a father, and as a man who understood, down to his bones, what was truly at stake. The echoes of the past rang loud in his mind, but this time, he was determined to make sure they didn't repeat without resistance. And in the quiet strength of that promise, the next chapter of their battle began. In the town of Oak Ridge, whispers traveled faster than the wind, slipping through grocery store aisles, PTA meetings, coffee shop corners, and school parking lots. By Monday morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Big Shaq was involved, not just dropping his son off, not just clapping from the sidelines, but involved pulling strings, making calls, bringing in lawyers. The name O'Neal hung in the air, like a spark waiting to catch. For some, it sparked hope. For others, it sparked fear. At Oak Ridge Academy, students clustered at lockers, their voices lowered, but sharp. "Did you hear? Jalen's dad's making a big deal out of it," one girl whispered, her blonde ponytail bobbing as she glanced over her shoulder. "He's probably trying to get those guys expelled," another chimed in. "I mean, Jalen's not exactly innocent, you know. He's always acting like he's better than everyone." The murmurs dug deep, rewriting the story before it had even fully surfaced. In a sunlit kitchen across town, Chase's father, Grant Westfield, sipped his black coffee as he scanned his phone. A city councilman with deep ties to local businesses, Grant was a man who knew how to play the game, and more importantly, how to win it before his opponents knew they were even playing. His wife Meredith perched across from him, her manicured nails tapping nervously on the marble countertop. "Shaquille O'Neal is coming after the boys, Grant," she said softly, worry etched across her flawless face. "You need to handle this." Grant set down his coffee, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I am handling it," he said calmly. His mind was already racing through plans, media contacts, board allies, parents who owed him favors. "We get ahead of it. We control the narrative." "What are you going to say?" Meredith asked, eyes wide. "That Jalen's an aggressive kid," Grant said smoothly. "That he's been stirring up trouble at the park for months. That Chase and the others were just trying to protect themselves. We make it look like they're the victims." Meredith hesitated, guilt flickering in her gaze. "But they shoved him, Grant." Grant's eyes hardened. "Do you want Chase's future ruined over some skate park drama? Because I guarantee you Shaq O'Neal doesn't care if our boys get buried. He'll roll over us if we let him." Across town, Shaq sat in his home office, flanked by Lucille and Shawnee, the tension thick but focused. Tyrell's voice crackled through the speakerphone, steady and assured. "They're going to try to flip this on Jalen," Tyrell warned. "They'll say he's disruptive, that he was threatening. They'll spin it to protect their own." Shaq nodded grimly. "Let them try." Lucille leaned forward, her sharp eyes blazing. "We don't need to yell, Shaquille. We need to be smarter." Shawnee placed a hand on Shaq's arm, her voice calm but urgent. "We need media people, community leaders, teachers who will stand up for Jalen's character. Not just what happened, but who he is." Shaq exhaled slowly, a flicker of determination settling into his chest. "Okay, let's pull them in." The days that followed became a quiet flurry of preparation. Tyrell worked behind the scenes, reaching out to journalists who cared about racial justice stories, gathering local allies, preparing statements. Shaq made discreet calls to his network, not to flex celebrity muscle, but to amplify the truth. Shawnee coordinated meetings with school officials, pushing back against the whispers that painted Jalen as the aggressor. Lucille, fierce and unrelenting, reached out to pastors, neighborhood organizers, mothers who had their own stories of bias and exclusion. Meanwhile, Jalen wrestled with his own storm. In his room, he stared at his skateboard leaning against the wall, its once bright deck dulled by scuffs and scratches. He remembered how it used to feel, the rush of freedom, the wind in his hair, the brief, beautiful moments where nothing else mattered. Now even the thought of skating made his stomach twist. What was the point? They'd already marked him, already twisted the story, already decided who he was. Downstairs, Shaq knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Hey Jay," he said softly. Jalen sat up, his expression guarded. "What?" Shaq crossed the room, sinking into the chair across from his son. "I know you're hurting," he began, his voice steady. "And I know it feels like walking away would be easier." Jalen's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like at school, Dad. They're all looking at me like I'm the problem." Shaq's heart clenched. "You're not the problem," he said firmly. "You're never the problem." Jalen shook his head, his voice rising. "But they're making me the problem." Shaq reached out, his massive hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. "Listen to me, son. This is how they win. By making you doubt yourself. By making you shrink. But you don't have to carry this alone. We're standing with you." Jalen's eyes shimmered with frustration, with pain, with the rawness of being 16, and feeling like the world was already closing in. But beneath the anger, there was a flicker, the faintest spark, of something steadier. Shaq smiled softly. "You don't have to win this fight by yourself." Across town, Grant Westfield gathered his allies at his home, the atmosphere tense but controlled. He paced the room, laying out the strategy. "We leak the right stories," he explained. We remind people how volatile Jalen has been. We push the school to clamp down before this gets out of hand. And if the press comes calling, we make sure they understand. This was an overreaction, nothing more. A man in a crisp suit raised an eyebrow. You're not worried about Shaq's reach? Grant smirked. Shaquille O'Neal's a celebrity. Celebrities come and go. This town listens to us. Back at the O'Neal home, the family gathered once more around the kitchen table. Tyrell's voice came through the speaker, calm but intense. They're laying the groundwork, Shaq. We need to be ready. Shaq nodded, his expression steeled. We're ready. Lucille smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with pride. They've underestimated you, Shaquille. They always have. Shawnee squeezed Jalen's hand, her voice a soft anchor. We've got your back, baby. Jalen looked around at his family, at the people rallying behind him, at the quiet army they had built. Not with fists, not with threats, but with strategy, with truth, with love. And for the first time since the skate park, he felt something shift deep inside. He wasn't just standing against Chase and Trent and Brody. He was standing for himself. And the storm was coming. Oak Ridge had always been a town that smiled on the surface. The kind of place where lawns were perfectly edged, where parents waved from SUVs at drop-off, where bake sales funded school trips and block parties were planned months in advance. But now, the surface was cracking. Quietly, urgently, the town was dividing. At the local church, Black families gathered in hushed circles after Sunday service, voices low but intense. Parents shared stories they'd buried for years. The teacher who always called their child aggressive for speaking up. The coach who praised talent but benched them when white parents complained. The store clerks who followed their sons around the aisles. Shaq stood among them, his presence both comforting and galvanizing. His status didn't shield him from understanding. It only made the injustice more bitter. He knew how hard it was to be heard when the town wanted to pretend it had no problems. Across town, in immaculate living rooms, and PTA side chats, white families huddled nervously. Did you hear about the skate park thing? One mother whispered over coffee. I mean, I'm sure Chase didn't mean anything, but now it's becoming this national thing. Another mother nodded, her lips tight. I heard Shaq's bringing in lawyers. They could ruin these boys' futures. The unspoken panic hung thick. This wasn't just about a skate park scuffle. It was about the possible shattering of Oak Ridge's carefully polished image. Shaq watched the division sharpen and knew he had to act. But not with threats, not with press conferences, or angry headlines. He decided to fight in the only way that couldn't be spun against them, with unity. With a story so visible, so undeniable, that no whisper campaign could smother it. He gathered Jalen and the family late one evening, spreading plans across the kitchen table, flyers, social posts, outreach lists. We're going to throw a skate rally, Shaq explained, his voice steady. Not a protest, not a legal fight, not yet. We celebrate the kids, the sport, the community. We make it a place where everyone's watching, and then we tell the truth. Jalen's stomach twisted. You want me to talk? In front of everyone? Shawnee squeezed his hand. You don't have to be perfect, baby. You just have to be real. Lucille nodded firmly. This town needs to hear your voice. Not your father's. Yours. Word spread fast. Shaq's team worked the media, pulling in reporters eager for a feel-good, high-profile story with stakes. The flyer promised a community skate event, celebrating unity, youth, and justice, with free skating, music, local food trucks, and the line that hooked the press, special remarks by NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal and his son Jalen. The town buzzed with anticipation. Some showed up, out of support, others out of curiosity. Still others, like Grant Westfield, Chase's father, showed up to watch, to measure, to prepare their next move. On the morning of the rally, Oak Ridge's Central Park transformed. Colorful banners hung over the skate ramps. Music pulsed from speakers. Local vendors set up tables lined with snacks and drinks. Kids zoomed across the pavement, laughing, their boards rattling over the concrete. Adults clustered on the sidelines, parents eyeing one another carefully, some with cautious smiles, others with cool reserve. Jalen stood at the edge of the stage platform, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Shaq crouched beside him, a massive reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've got this, Jay, he murmured. Just speak your truth. Jalen's palms were sweaty, his stomach twisted, but when his name was called, he forced himself forward, stepping up to the mic, blinking against the sunlight and the sea of faces. He cleared his throat, the mic catching the nervous crackle. "Hi, I'm Jalen O'Neal." His voice shook, but he kept going. "Some of you know me, some probably don't. But you've probably heard about what happened." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jalen swallowed hard. "I'm here because I love skating. I love this town. And I don't want to be scared to show up at a park, or a school, or anywhere, just because of how I look." His voice steadied. "I know some people think this is about making trouble, about blaming people. But it's not. It's about saying, we all deserve to be here. We all deserve to feel safe, to feel welcome." He paused, his chest tight, his eyes scanning the crowd. And that's when he saw them. Off to the side, Chase, Trent and Brody stood watching, their arms folded, their faces tight. Behind them loomed Grant Westfield, flanked by a few polished, smirking adults. Parents, lawyers, allies. Jalen felt his throat dry up, but worse than the sight of them was the realization that they weren't there to listen. They were here to strike. Even before the event ended, whispers began to ripple. Someone had slipped a story to the local press that Jalen had been seen vandalizing the skate park the week before, tagging walls late at night, causing damage. A few blurry photos surfaced, grainy, unclear, but just enough to plant doubt. Reporters eager for angles began murmuring, jotting notes. Parents exchanged glances. The carefully built atmosphere of unity began to quiver at the edges. Shaq sensed it immediately. His jaw tightened as he stepped toward Tyrell, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "They're moving," Shaq murmured. "They're trying to spin this now." Tyrell's eyes flicked toward the cluster where Grant stood, his arm draped casually over Chase's shoulder, a knowing smile on his lips. "We expected this," Tyrell said calmly. "Stay steady." On stage, Jalen faltered, his eyes darting nervously as the crowd buzzed. Shawnee stepped forward from the side, offering a supportive smile, mouthing, "You're okay." Drawing a shaky breath, Jalen gripped the mic tighter. "I know not everyone wants to hear this," he said, his voice trembling. "But we can't fix anything if we keep pretending it's not there." The crowd stilled. Shaq moved forward then, stepping up beside his son, towering, calm, magnetic. His deep voice rolled out across the space. "This is my son," he said, placing a steady hand on Jalen's shoulder. "He's not perfect. None of us are. But he deserves the same chance, the same space, the same respect as every kid out here." His gaze swept across the faces, the supportive, the skeptical, the calculating. "We're not here to shame anyone. We're here to lift something better, together." The final words hung heavy, charged, vibrating across the crowd, like a challenge. Chase shifted uncomfortably. Grant's smile twitched. And somewhere deep in the crowd, the fault lines of Oak Ridge began to quake. Because this wasn't just about a boy with a skateboard anymore. It was about a town on edge, and the storm that was coming next. The applause had barely settled when the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Jalen's heart was still pounding from his speech, his face flushed with the rush of saying what had sat like a stone on his chest for days. The crowd around the skate park hummed with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Reporters hovered near the stage, jotting notes, watching Shaq with the kind of anticipation they usually reserved for playoff games or celebrity appearances. Then suddenly, the mood shifted. A ripple of movement near the back caught everyone's attention. Chase Westfield stepped forward, his usual smugness replaced by a carefully arranged look of concern. Trent and Brody flanked him, playing the part of reluctant witnesses, their arms folded, their faces serious. And behind them, Grant Westfield emerged, confident, polished, with a subtle nod to the cameramen trailing just behind. Chase cleared his throat dramatically, loud enough for the nearest microphones to catch. "We didn't want to say anything," he began, "but people need to know the full story." A hush fell. The reporters, like sharks scenting blood, swung toward the disruption, cameras now trained on Chase. Grant spoke smoothly, hands raised as if trying to calm the gathering storm. "We all want unity here," he said, voice dripping with practiced charm. "But it's important that we're honest. Last week, there was significant vandalism at the skate park. Graffiti, property damage, and several people," he gestured vaguely, "saw Jalen O'Neal there after hours." Jalen's stomach dropped. His pulse roared in his ears. His legs suddenly felt hollow. Brody stepped forward, holding up his phone. "We have video," he said, tapping the screen to pull up a shaky, poorly lit clip. It showed a hooded figure tagging a wall, barely visible, the image grainy, but just clear enough to suggest a profile, a silhouette. Gasps murmured through the crowd. Reporters surged forward, questions flying. Jalen, is that you? Shaquille, do you have a comment? Are you denying the footage? Jalen's throat went dry. His hands trembled at his sides. He wanted to shout, to deny it, but the noise swelled too fast, swallowing him whole. He felt the weight of 100 stares pressing in, the humiliation, the fear, the awful certainty that the truth no longer mattered. But beside him Shaq was unmoved, calm, collected, almost smiling. He stepped forward, his presence enough to draw immediate silence. His voice, when it came, was smooth and steady, the voice of a man who had walked through storms, bigger than this. I'm glad you brought that up, Shaq said softly, turning to face Grant, Chase, and the cameras, because we were wondering when you'd play that card. Grant's confident smile faltered. Chase blinked, confused. Brody's brow furrowed. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a practiced tap, he connected it to the nearby screen set up for the rally. The giant monitor behind the stage flickered to life, displaying crisp, high-definition footage. See, we anticipated someone might try to twist the truth. Shaq continued, his voice carrying easily over the stunned crowd. So we installed extra surveillance cameras at the skate park 2 weeks ago, with full city approval. The screen played back clear footage, Jalen skating alone in the afternoon, packing up his things before sunset. Another clip showed the skate park late at night, empty, until Chase, Trent, and Brody appeared, laughing, daring each other, one of them pulling out spray paint. The timestamps were undeniable. The faces were undeniable. A gasp rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled to adjust their cameras. Chase's face drained of color. Shaq let the footage roll as he spoke, his tone measured but firm. We believe in accountability, for everyone. But accountability starts with truth. And the truth is, my son didn't do this. He turned slightly, looking directly at Grant. Your boys did. The crowd buzzed. A growing wave of whispers, murmurs, questions. Parents exchanged stunned glances. Reporters pivoted, firing fresh questions in Grant's direction. Jalen stood frozen, heart pounding, his chest tightening, as the weight began to lift. He watched Chase and the others fumble, their carefully rehearsed ambush crumbling in real time. Grant tried to recover, raising his hands, shaking his head. This isn't what it looks like. Shaq held up a hand, stopping him cold. No need to explain, Grant. The facts speak loud enough. The reporters surged, eager to shift the narrative. Microphones thrust toward Chase, toward Trent, toward Brody, who all shrank back, their earlier bravado vanished. The cameras that once pressed in on Jalen now turned sharply, their lenses hungry for the unraveling story. Terrell appeared at Shaq's side, his sharp suit crisp, his eyes glinting with quiet triumph. We have statements, witnesses, and records ready, he murmured under his breath. They can try to spin it, but we've got the receipts. Jalen's knees nearly gave out. He felt his father's arm wrap firmly around his shoulders, grounding him. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt the tide shift, not just in his favor, but in truth's favor. Shaq leaned down, his voice low but fierce. You see, son, you don't beat them by shouting. You beat them by standing steady and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. As the crowd buzzed louder, as the media rushed to catch every angle, Jalen turned to face the people who had doubted him, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had waited for him to crumble. His voice was quiet, but this time it didn't shake. I just wanted to skate, he said simply. And in that small, unshakable sentence, the storm that had hung over him for weeks finally began to break. Across the park, Chase's crew slipped back, pale and silent. Grant's phone buzzed non-stop in his pocket. Reporters, lawyers, allies, suddenly less eager to align themselves with a sinking ship. And under the sharp, bright glare of truth, the cracks in their story shattered wide open. Shaq stood tall beside his son, a calm giant holding the line. A father who had learned long ago that real power isn't in crushing your enemies, it's in dismantling the lies they build. And as Oak Ridge watched, as the cameras rolled, as the story rewrote itself live before their eyes, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about one skate park or one moment. This was about exposing the kind of injustice that thrives in the shadows and bringing it, finally, into the light. The days after the skate rally moved like a tremor under Oak Ridge's polished streets. A low, humming quake that rattled in kitchens, school hallways, city offices, and backyard patios. By Tuesday, the news had gone regional. Headlines flashed across social media. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal stands up for son in small-town showdown, and teens exposed in skate park smear, town grapples with racial divide. But the real shockwave wasn't the headlines, it was the emails. Late Monday night, an anonymous source leaked a string of messages to a local reporter. Messages pulled from Grant Westfield's private correspondence. The emails revealed conversations between Grant and a tight-knit circle of Oak Ridge parents, detailing how they had coordinated a counter-narrative against Jalen O'Neal. The emails were meticulous, calculated, and devastating. One outlined how they'd coached their sons on what to say to reporters. Another offered up the grainy, doctored footage with a note. Make sure this gets in front of the right people, before Shaq takes over the story. Yet another showed Grant texting Chase. Stay cool. We'll handle it. The O'Neals won't risk their image on this. The next morning, parents who had once whispered behind closed doors sat in stunned silence at breakfast tables, scrolling through the published screenshots on their phones. One father shook his head slowly, murmuring, I didn't think Grant would actually organize it. A mother nearby clutched her coffee mug tighter, her voice breaking slightly. We just wanted to stay out of it. We didn't want trouble. But now the trouble was undeniable. At school, the atmosphere shifted sharply. Jalen walked down the hallway, his head high as classmates who had once snickered or avoided his gaze now paused, uncertain. Some gave him small nods. Others watched with wide, guilty eyes, unsure what to say. Teachers who had remained silent before now offered polite smiles or quick words of support. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a sweeping transformation. But it was a crack, a small, undeniable rupture in the town's polished surface. Meanwhile, Shaq sat in his home office. The leaked emails spread out on the desk before him. Tyrell sat across from him, sharp-eyed and focused, flipping through the pages. This is big, Tyrell murmured. This isn't just a skate park story anymore. This is a public reckoning. Shawnee, seated by the window, crossed her arms. And what happens to Grant? She asked quietly. Tyrell shrugged slightly. The court of public opinion's already turned on him. The city council's scrambling. There'll be internal investigations, maybe ethics complaints. But honestly, that's not the point. Shaq leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. No, he agreed, his voice soft but certain. The point is the town saw the mask fall. They can't pretend anymore. Later that evening, Shaq and Jalen walked together through the skate park, now empty, quiet, the late sun casting long shadows over the ramps. Jalen carried his board under one arm, his steps lighter, his face no longer clouded by the weight of shame or fear. He looked up at his father, a question flickering in his eyes. Did we win, Dad? Shaq paused, smiling faintly. What do you think? Jalen kicked a pebble across the concrete, thoughtful. They got exposed. People know the truth now. But, he hesitated, searching for the words. It's not like everything's fixed. Shaq chuckled softly. No, it's not. His gaze swept across the park, the town beyond. But sometimes the win isn't about fixing everything. It's about making it impossible for people to keep pretending. Jalen let the words settle, feeling them click into place inside his chest. For the first time, he understood the deeper current of what they'd fought for. Not just justice for himself, but the kind of justice that forced a whole community to look in the mirror. Across Oak Ridge, conversations were shifting. Black parents, long cautious about speaking out, now found themselves being approached by white neighbors, by teachers, by parents who asked, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes earnestly, how they could help, what they hadn't seen, what they hadn't understood. There were no grand apologies, no sweeping changes overnight, but there were doors opening that had been sealed tight before, and that, Shaq knew, was how change began. Grant Westfield, once the town's golden figure, now found himself dodging reporters, fielding angry calls from fellow council members, scrambling to salvage his reputation. Chase, Trent, and Brody kept their heads down at school, their social media feeds locked, their once invincible swagger drained. The lies they'd crafted had collapsed, and the town was watching. But the O'Neals didn't focus on public shame. They focused on the quiet triumph, the rebuilding of Jalen's spirit. In the O'Neal home, Lucille pulled Jalen close one evening, her arms wrapping him in a fierce, unshakable hug. You stood tall, baby, she whispered against his hair. Don't ever let anyone make you small again. Shawnee kissed her son's forehead, smiling through the tears that threatened to spill. You didn't just stand up for yourself, Jalen. You stood up for every kid who's ever been pushed down. And Shaq the giant, the legend, the father, watched his son with eyes gleaming, pride swelling in his chest. He knew Jalen's journey wasn't over. The world would throw more tests, more challenges, more unfair fights. But now, Jalen knew his own strength, and he knew he didn't stand alone. The next day, Shaq sat with Tyrell over coffee, the two old friends reflecting on what had unfolded. You know, Tyrell mused, this town will probably recover. They'll smooth things over, make gestures, hold a few public meetings. Shaq nodded slowly.
Yeah.
But the real win, Tyrell continued, smiling faintly, is that they can't unsee what they've seen. They can't unlearn it. Shaq chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. Good. Outside, Jalen skated down the driveway, his board smooth under his feet, the evening light casting a soft glow over the pavement. For the first time in weeks, he felt free again, not because the world had changed overnight, but because this wasn't just about one boy, or one skate park, or one beating. It was about a town forced to face itself, and a boy who had learned he was stronger than the lies that tried to define him. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, slid under the door of the Oak Ridge City Council chambers, stamped with the authority of Tyrell Harper. It was crisp, direct, and carried a punch beneath its polished legal phrasing. A formal civil rights complaint against the Oak Ridge Council, the school board, and the skate park management, alleging racial bias, public discrimination, and coordinated defamation. It named, and once the press caught wind, Oak Ridge's once quiet streets erupted into a storm of attention they could no longer contain. National outlets picked up the story, their headlines sharp and unforgiving. Small-town suburb faces reckoning over skate park racism, and Shaquille O'Neal's fight for justice shakes Oak Ridge. Reporters rolled into town like a tide, microphones in hand, cameras flashing at every public building, every city official. What had once been whispered at PTA meetings, and silence behind manicured lawns, was now on full display, the mask ripped away. Inside the O'Neal mansion, however, the mood wasn't one of celebration or gloating. Shaq paced his office, Tyrell sitting calmly across from him, papers neatly arranged on the table. Lucille sat near the window, knitting steadily, her sharp eyes flicking up now and then to watch her son. Shani leaned against the wall, her arms folded, her expression a mix of resolve and concern. Shaq ran a hand over his shaved head, exhaling slowly. You sure we want to take it this far? Tyrell gave a faint smile. Shaq, we're already in it. And it's not just about your family anymore. This complaint forces them to address the system, not just the incident. Lucille nodded firmly. They need to face what they've been ignoring for years. Shawnee added softly, and Jalen needs to know that this matters. That he matters. Downstairs, Jalen stood at the window, watching as local kids gathered in the driveway, boards tucked under their arms, waiting for him. Word had spread through the schools, through the town. Jalen was still skating. He hadn't quit, hadn't disappeared, and now other kids, black and white alike, came to join him, to ride alongside him. He turned as his father stepped into the room, Shaq's towering presence filling the doorway. Hey Dad, Jalen murmured. Shaq smiled softly. They waiting for you? Jalen gave a shy grin. Yeah, thought I'd show them a few tricks. Shaq crossed the room, resting a massive hand gently on his son's shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was thick with quiet pride. You know, Jay, I've won a lot in my life. Championships, deals, fame, but none of it matters as much as what you just did. Jalen blinked, startled. What did I do? Shaq crouched slightly, so they were eye to eye. You stood taller than I ever did. Not on the court. Not on TV. In here. He tapped Jalen's chest lightly. You didn't let them break you. Jalen swallowed hard, his throat tight. Outside, the mansion had become a symbol, not of wealth, not of celebrity, but of resilience. Reporters angled for interviews. Parents approached for advice. Community leaders reached out asking how to help. But inside, the O'Neal family focused not on the noise, but on each other. They knew the real victory wasn't in a court ruling, or a settlement, or a headline. It was in the way Jalen had reclaimed his spirit, his place, his voice. At the skate park, kids watched in awe as Jalen flipped his board cleanly off the edge of the rail, landing with a smooth, practiced ease. He laughed, light and unguarded, as younger skaters clapped and cheered. One little boy, no older than 9, approached shyly. "Are you Jalen O'Neal?" Jalen grinned. "Yeah, that's me." The boy's eyes widened. "You're awesome." For the first time in weeks, Jalen felt something loosen in his chest. A lightness, a joy, a freedom. This was what he loved. This was what they couldn't take. Back at home, Shaq sat with Tyrell late into the night, the two old friends reflecting on the whirlwind. "You know," Tyrell mused, swirling his coffee thoughtfully, "I've been in this fight a long time. I've seen towns like Oak Ridge try to bury stories like this. Smooth them over, pretend they never happened." Shaq leaned back, his expression calm. "But this time they can't." Tyrell smiled faintly. "No, they can't." Shaq rubbed his chin, his eyes thoughtful. "What happens next?" Tyrell gave a small shrug. "That's up to them. They can push back or they can change. But either way, they've been seen." That night, as the house settled into quiet, Shaq stepped into Jalen's room, finding his son already half asleep, his skateboard propped by the bed. Shaq sat gently on the edge of the mattress, brushing a hand over Jalen's hair. "You did good, son," he murmured softly. "I'm proud of you." Jalen stirred slightly, his voice drowsy. "Thanks, Dad." Shaq smiled, leaning down to press a kiss to his son's forehead. "Rest, Jay. We've got more days ahead." In the stillness of the night, as Oak Ridge held its breath and the weight of justice hung heavy in the air, the O'Neal family found peace not in triumph, but in togetherness. Because real justice, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, doesn't come from a courtroom. It comes from a heart that refuses to break. The air in Oak Ridge had shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. It had been months since the rally, months since the civil rights complaint made its way through legal channels, months since the town was forced to confront the rot under its pristine surface. Oak Ridge didn't transform overnight, didn't flip from flawed to perfect with the strike of a headline. But change had settled into the cracks, small at first, steady now, like light creeping under a long-closed door. On the school bulletin boards, a new flyer hung alongside club announcements and soccer tryouts. Youth Unity Circle, a space for conversations, questions, and real talk. All students welcome. On the city's community calendar, events popped up with unfamiliar titles: Diversity in Oak Ridge, Listening and Learning, Skate for Change charity event, Parent-Teen Dialogue Night. These weren't fixes, not really. They were beginning. Jalen O'Neal walked the halls of Oak Ridge Academy, no longer invisible, and no longer a target. He wasn't popular in the glossy high school movie sense. He wasn't crowned homecoming king, or nominated for class president. But when he passed by, heads lifted, hands raised in small, respectful waves. His name wasn't whispered behind backs anymore. It was spoken openly, sometimes even with a note of admiration. In the skate park, Jalen became something unexpected, a quiet symbol. He wasn't the best skater technically. There were others who pulled sharper tricks, landed riskier jumps. But his presence carried weight. Younger kids watched him with wide eyes. Parents nodded in his direction. Even the local reporter who once trailed Shaq's every move, now sometimes swung by just to catch a quote from Jalen, asking about the new youth programs, the skate events, the mentoring he'd started casually on Saturdays. Shaquille O'Neal, meanwhile, stayed mostly in the background, exactly where he wanted to be. He still showed up, of course, at school board meetings, at city discussions, at late-night planning sessions in living rooms filled with neighbors eager to change the conversation. But he didn't lead with his fame, didn't make it about his name. Instead, he positioned himself as what mattered most to him: a father helping clear the path so his son and every other kid like Jalen could walk forward unafraid. One afternoon, Shaq stood on the edge of the skate park, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching Jalen soar effortlessly across the ramps. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced across the concrete. Lucille stood beside her son, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her sharp eyes softening as she watched her grandson fly. "You see that, Shaquille?" Lucille murmured, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That's your real legacy." Shaq let out a quiet breath, his gaze locked on Jalen's silhouette against the golden light. "It was never the trophies, was it, Ma?" Lucille chuckled softly. "It's always been bigger than basketball, baby." As the town hummed around them, Shaq felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, exactly, and not relief. It was something deeper, something steadier, a sense of rightness. He had built businesses, earned championships, stood in spotlights, but here now, standing at the edge of a skate park, watching his son reclaim his space, he knew this was the work that mattered most. Jalen coasted to a stop, grinning as he pushed sweat-soaked hair off his forehead. He waved at his dad, calling out, "Did you see that one?" Shaq grinned back, clapping his massive hands together. Every second, as they packed up for the night, kids drifted over, some eager to show off a new move, others just wanting to share a word or two with Jalen. Shaq hung back, watching the way his son navigated these small, meaningful moments. Not with arrogance, not with the weight of being the kid with the famous dad, but with quiet resilience. Later, as they loaded the gear into the SUV, Shaq rested a hand on Jalen's shoulder. "Proud of you, son." Jalen looked up, a flicker of surprise and warmth crossing his face. "Thanks, Dad." They drove home in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of battles faced and survived, of trust built not through grand declarations, but through steady shared experience. In the weeks that followed, Oak Ridge saw more shifts. Grant Westfield stepped down quietly from the city council, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Chase, Trent, and Brody drifted to the sidelines, their influence dimmed, their circle fractured. But the O'Neals didn't linger on their fall. They focused forward. Shawnee worked with a coalition of parents to establish new school policies around bullying and bias. Lucille hosted community teas and quiet conversations, coaxing reluctant neighbors into honest dialogue. Terrell, ever the strategist, expanded his legal work, helping nearby towns take similar steps. And Jalen skated. He skated because it was his love, his freedom, his language. And as he skated, he inspired others, not by shouting, not by demanding attention, but by simply refusing to fade. By showing up again and again with his head high and his heart steady. One evening, as the family sat on the back porch, watching the stars blink to life above the darkened town, Jalen turned to his father, his voice quiet but certain. "Dad, thanks for fighting for me." Shaq wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, pulling him close. "You fought for yourself, Jay. I just stood beside you." Lucille, sipping her tea nearby, smiled into the night. "That's the hardest part, you know," she murmured, "standing steady when the world wants you to fall." Shaq pressed a kiss to Jalen's head, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me that, nah." As the night deepened, as Oak Ridge settled into uneasy but undeniable change, the O'Neals sat together, not as a celebrity family, not as symbols in a news cycle, but as what they had always been, a family bound by love, resilience, and a shared refusal to break under the weight of injustice. Because the hardest battles, the ones that echo into tomorrow, are the ones fought without fists, and the truest victories are the ones etched not in headlines, but in the quiet, unshakable strength of the heart. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Carry it into your own conversations, your own neighborhoods. Ask what's hidden behind the smiles in your town, what truths are waiting to be faced. Remember, real change doesn't come from watching heroes. It comes from standing beside them. The next chapter of Justice isn't written by headlines. It's written by